Good morning, everyone. My name is Faure, so Faure, or Faure Smith. Some people would know those places. Thank you for the introduction, so not much to add there. Maybe just to mention that I'm not familiar with potato farming, although I do have a farming background. My dad farms there in the Northern Cape with some sheep. And I also do know that my wife and our little daughter is very fond of potatoes because we almost dubbed her name as Ilaria Slapchip van Schalkwyk, because my wife, while she was expecting, had some chips with all of her foods, even if it was a waffle. And now that she's born, all we order is just a bowl of potatoes. So she is very fond of that, so it's part of our lives, even though we're not active in the industry. So for today's discussion, I would like to talk about and give you a very high-level overview of the landscape in terms of energy, focusing a bit more on alternative energy. So let's jump in. Okay, so I'll first just give a snapshot of the current energy supply challenges. I think most of us are very well aware of the challenges that we've got in the country in terms of power supply, so I'm not going to repeat that. Then I'll just give you a snapshot about alternative energy in South Africa, what is happening already, and we'll look at alternative energy technology, existing and new ones that's coming into the front, and then we could also discuss what are the future energy applications. Okay, so the first thing that I want to highlight, this came from a very recent CSIR report in terms of load shedding and energy availability, is that the first thing, which I think we already know, is that there's this exponential increase of load shedding that we had in the past few years. And it's, yeah, the impact in the economy is drastic, and I think everybody felt it in one way or another. The other thing that you would pick up is our energy availability factor. Two things. The first thing is to notice that we actually went below the 50% mark. Now, let's just understand the concept of a EAF. Energy availability factor means that there's a certain capacity installed, there's 100% capacity in theory, and how much of that installed capacity is available to supply power. And end of last year, we were sitting below 50%, which is horrible because the other half of the generation plants are not running. The second thing that I want to point out, because there's always the question of where are we heading? What's ahead of us? And I would just say, look at the numbers. If you look at the trajectory of the power supply and the trajectory in terms of load shedding, unfortunately, it's not giving us a very positive indication of what's coming. And as soon as you have government starting to support and say, put up your own solar, and banks financing it as well, that should also be a sign of that they also expect that we're going to sit with some challenges in the near future. Okay, so in terms of new generation that we need, it's about 6,000 megawatts. So there's a very big gap in terms of what's being installed and what's necessary in the industry. If we look at the energy mix, we know that bulk of our energy supply comes from coal. And the interesting thing is last year was the first year that we went below the 80% mark in terms of coal. So we're very dependent on coal supply, but we start to see that there's alternative forms of energy coming in as wind, solar, CSP, that's contributing to that. But you can see that there's still a very big gap in terms of what's required in the country versus what is available. Now, if we talk about alternative energy in South Africa, what is the uptake in terms of the technologies and what's been procured and installed in our country? Now, the first one I want to highlight is storage. Now, in the past, I want to say about 5 to 10 years, the focus was mainly on solar PV with the intention to reduce their bill or to reduce their consumption. But with the increasing of load shedding, you can almost say that you could see that follows that same pattern. As we have increase of load shedding, there's a drastic increase in terms of storage applications. And what we saw is about last year alone, about 12 billion rand spent to procure about 1.2 gigawatt hours of storage. And I mean, that storage itself, can, if it was working collectively, can actually reduce a possible stage of load shedding. Because one stage of load shedding is 1,000 watts. So we could actually take 1 hour of load shedding away just with the batteries that's been procured last year. And keep in mind, these numbers does not include the big utility scale application. This is all on better generation. So that's at the consumption point, at the point of where you are getting your power supply. There's also a spend on batteries of about inverters, about 7 billion rand. And then in terms of PV, it's about 5 billion rand. So you can see there's a big difference between much more being spent on batteries compared to PV. And that's about 1.5 gigawatt of PV. And the expectation is that for 2023, we're looking at about 2.3 gigawatts of solar that's going to be imported and installed in the next few years. Now, the question is, okay, this is what's happening locally. What's happening internationally? Those who were following pricing or costs in terms of solar PV and storage and any technology for that matter would have seen that over the years there has been a decrease in terms of solar PV and a decrease in terms of storage cost. So the cost in terms of that technology is already quite competitive compared to the past. The challenge, however, is that we are reaching now a stage where the pricing is stabilizing, and we've also started to see that even in some cases the prices are going up. And there's two reasons for that. One, there's a very big challenge in terms of commodity pricing worldwide. And then obviously in Europe, there's a big push for energy independency. So where they normally focus just on solar PV, all of a sudden they, for example, want to increase their PV and start to include storage. So that means there's a bigger competition in terms of having access to these technologies, and we now are competing with them to get that in our country. And then the second one, which is a little bit more local, supply and demand. Because of all the load shedding, there's a very high demand on these technologies, which obviously by default pushes up the price. I know, for example, solar PV panels, for a few weeks, there was just no stock available in the country. Some people waiting for a month or two before they're going to get their stock. So there's really a challenge in that regard, and that by default also pushes up the price. The point I just want to make is I don't foresee waiting will give you necessarily better or competitive pricing. So we might be at the stabilization point. So if you're considering it, this might be a good time to do that. Okay, just to expand in terms of the impact, when we look at shopping centers, like Pick n Pay and Shoprite Checkers, they spend about 150 million rand per month on backup power supply. Now, and then we have state hospitals talking about in a year's time, that's about 7 million rand that they have to spend. Now, this is money spent that you can't really get back for. You don't have something tangible to show for it afterwards. So if we were to spend this money just from the get-go, we're talking about that every month we could have installed about 20 megawatts of solar, just utilizing that money. And that 20 megawatts will be there for the next 20 to 30 years. So it just shows you how, money could have been spent totally different if we, approach it a bit differently. In terms of technology, most power supply or alternative supply, there's a very big preference for grid-connected hybrid systems. So what am I talking about? Eskom will be there. It's not an off-grid cut-off Eskom situation. You would have some form of a hybrid inverter that's connected to storage and solar. So it's a combination of these three, keeping Eskom there. There's also a very big preference to lithium-ion batteries because of their cost, because of the maturity of the product itself, and the availability of that as well. I'll talk about that a bit more going forward. Other technologies to consider that could come into the front is lithium titanate. It's actually an existing technology and it's being used in the military space. They actually combine that technology with supercapacitors. I don't know if you heard about, or there might be some clients with supercapacitors, but if you actually open up the battery, you will see that it's a combination of supercaps and a very high quality lithium ion type. The challenge, however, with the lithium titanate is that it is quite expensive, and that's why there's a preference for the lithium iron phosphate batteries. Another battery that's already being applied, and I foresee we're going to see more of that going forward, is vanadium redox, or flow batteries is the other term that they talk about. The challenge with this is that it really doesn't make sense for small scale applications like residential or small businesses. Where this would be used is more utility scale, so very large scale megawatts of storage that you can install. There's obviously challenges in terms of the efficiency and improvements, but there's still a lot of room for improvements on this technology, and we do have the local resources and the commodities to produce these batteries. We've got locally produced vanadium batteries that can be procured. Now, if we look at about energy storage solutions worldwide, and we look at the mix, interesting enough, a big portion of our storage. And I want to say even sometimes your renewable energy supply is from pumped hydro and hydropower supply. So that's a very big portion. Now, maybe just something to highlight here is that if I don't know if you're aware, but recently government has opened up the options and the regulations to allow for people, private people, to set up their own hydro or hydro pump schemes or hydro power plants, even utilizing governmental waters. So that in itself is an opportunity, especially if you are quite close to a river or close to a dam. But if we take it further, you'll see that it's followed by lithium ion worldwide being a very big portion. And then this is followed by other technologies like sodium batteries, lead acid batteries, and flow batteries, and the rest would follow. So you will see that in terms of what's happening worldwide, we are following more or less what the technology, the mature technology that's in the market. Now, I mean, this chart has been developed a few years ago. I foresee that all of the dots that you see there has already started moving forward, where we're in the more mature technology. Mature, it's being deployed and it's more mature and being used. So here you'll see, for example, pumped hydro storage or hydropower will be in a more mature environment. And because of the more mature, it brings down the cost. And that's, for example, where something like lead acid would fall in as well. But if we look at all the other batteries, flow, lithium ion, molten salt. By the way, molten salt is CSP. CSP in Uppington, they've got these towers with all these mirrors. They're concentrated at one point. And that's the molten salt. So they actually store the energy in a molten salt format. We've got flywheels, sodium batteries. I've read a few articles that's looking to this as an alternative to lithium ion because of the materials that they use, which are more abundantly available, but there's still a lot of research that needs to be done there. And then compressed energy is also an application. So, and then if we look at what's coming, and our next presenter will talk a bit about, for example, the hydrogen, we'll see that the supercapacitors, yes, it's being applied, but there's still some demonstration and development work that should be done. And then hydrogen, I think, is the new kid on the block that we're talking about in terms of storing energy that's coming into the fray. Right, so if we just want to quickly talk about panels, solar PV panels itself, I think we came a very long way since PV started to pick up big time in South Africa around 2011. At that stage, we were looking at efficiency of about 15%. Now, just to explain, 15% of efficiency means of the 100% sunlight, only 15% is converted into electricity. And the reason for that is because only a certain spectrum of the light is used to generate power. And that 15% is the 230 watts. So it's not 15% off 230. So don't get that number wrong. So 230 watts is the output that you get after taking the 15% into account. Now, if we go forward, in the past, there was a very big preference for polycrystalline or multicrystalline panels. And mono did exist, but people didn't go for it because of pricing. But there's now a worldwide tendency to go for the monocrystalline panels because of the high efficiencies and other benefits that comes with it. Now, this technology has now developed further where you have bifacial mono panels. In other words, it's not just power coming from the front, but also power from the back. So if you've got an elevated system and there's sunlight reflected from the surrounding environment, you can actually increase your power output from that panel. And we're talking about anything from 3 to 7% more. Now, you might argue that's not much, but if you're going to calculate that on a very large scale, it's quite a lot. And the other technology that's coming in is bifacial half-cell technologies. So half-cell is just, you'll see that these are all full cells, and half-cells, and that's typically your larger panels, is to actually decrease the current from these cells, and that actually makes the panel much more efficient because there's less IR losses. And if we look at the wattage of the panels in 2023, there's already sitting at 600 watts or more. The typical efficiency is in the range of about 20%, so you can see jumping from 15 to 20%. But based on the PV module manufacturers, they're expecting any efficiencies in the range of 23 to 25% about if we look at 2025. So we do see some increase in terms of efficiencies, and we also will see that with newer or different types of PV technologies. Okay, so other future outlooks. The other application to consider is that in the past, most of our loads are being supplied by AC. So if you look at the house, you're sitting with 230 volts AC, that's supplying all your AC loads. But if you think about it carefully, a lot of our loads in the house are actually operating on DC. Think about it. Your TV, your cell phones, your laptops, your computers, all of these things actually operate on DC. And every time when we need to convert it from AC to DC, there's a lot of losses. And the thing about renewable energy or alternative energy is that a lot of these sources are DC as well. So if we can generate power in DC, we store it in DC and use it in DC, it's a much more effective system, and you need less components. For example, you don't need the inverter, which reduces the cost. So that might be something to look out for going into the future. And there's already countries converting their network going to DC because of this application. Another one is electric vehicles. Now you might argue and say, okay, but where does this fit in? You know, I think in your context with the farming, you most probably might want to go for the hydrogen vehicles with the larger tractors and the trucks. I think that's a more sensible application. But the thing about electric vehicles is that this can be used as a mechanism to store energy. So instead of paying a lot of money for a storage system, you use your electric vehicle to store the power and supply power from that during load shedding. And this can actually support the grid in terms of if it all works together. So options that we considered or look into for the potato industry, because that's what you want to know. So I've investigated agrivoltaics or agri-solar. For those who don't know what that is, it's actually a typical standard solar PV farm. The PV panels are lifted a bit higher, they're spaced a bit more. They would use, for example, a transparent panel so the light could go through. And then you can actually produce food underneath. Now, Sun Farming is the German company that I'm doing consulting work for. They are realizing agrivoltaics worldwide. They've done some tests and examples on potatoes, and even though it works, the quality and the quantity is just not there. So based on what we've seen, something to consider, but I'm of the view that there's other type of crop that would be a better option to consider. Other option would be floating solar PV systems. So if you're sitting with a dam or a river or some form of water supply and you want to reduce evaporation, then you could put your PV on that. A lot of people in our training ask us, what can you do for theft? And it seems like as soon as you put the panels on the water, people tend to leave it out. So that prevents overnight corrosion, as we call it. Okay, then biogas. Biogas is another option. So I've investigated that quickly, and based on one specific full supply chain potato farmer, and Johan, he'll talk about today, they were sitting about, I worked out as quickly like 10 tons per day in terms of wastage, and that translates to potentially putting up a biogas plant that can give you more or less the same power as 1 megawatt of solar PV. So that shows you that there's potential. But the thing about biogas, and actually all of these points that I want to raise, is that keep in mind, we cannot expect other technologies to be mature and ready to employ as solar PV. Because when solar PV started, at that stage, it was a very high-risk technology. People didn't know how well it's going to work and if it makes sense. So they had to do the feasibility studies and the detailed inspections before funders and people could contribute or participate in that regard. And now it's almost like a no-brainer because everybody's doing it and we know it works. But we need to follow the same approach with these new technologies. So, for example, the biogas, I think there's potential. But one needs to do a feasibility study and to look at the whole spectrum and look at all the wastage, because it's not just the potatoes. It might be the wastage in terms of the processing. It might be even the cooking oil that's being used for the potatoes, because they actually need that to improve the yield or the energy that you can get from the potatoes. So these are things I would just in general mention to consider if we're going to consider these other applications. And then we're going to talk about the future of the grid. I read an article which Chris Yelland wrote a while ago. They had a presentation there, and we are in an electricity revolution, as they call it. So in the past, it was mainly Eskom supplying powers, but we are now moving towards where private individuals are supplying and producing their own powers. And that is what you as the industry would have as well. So either you have your own solar system or you're planning to have one, but we are participating in this electricity revolution where we're not just going to have some form of central power supply being fed to the rest of the network, but there's these decentralized power supply where we supply it where we need it, and that we can create this independence. This is where also, for example, the concept of microgrids start to come into play. So what do I mean with microgrids? So microgrids is that instead of having this national network that has to work together, you can actually create a microgrid between farmers, for example. And then collectively, you can sit together to say, listen, between ourselves, we can generate enough power and work together so that if there's load shedding, we isolate and we operate. Although we know in the news that there are areas where there's challenges in this regard. And I think that's regulation-wise an area that we need to address or to overcome to allow for this independence. But it's important that if we do that, we always need to look at the sustainability and the stability of the grid. And I think that's the biggest concern that we do need to overcome if we're going to have private individuals overtaking some utility responsibilities when it comes to power supply. Okay, so to summarize, how much minutes do I got left? I don't want to... Oh, so I can go for it. Okay, I don't want to rush. So the first thing is to be aware of that alternative energy solutions are there. It exists, it's out there, it can be used. Now, one of the things that you might argue, and I think there's a few that's already running diesel generators, we calculated more or less the operating costs, and in terms of just fuel, sits around 6 rand, 8 rand a unit, a kilowatt hour. If you look at the LCOE, it's called the levelized cost of energy. In other words, from the point where you buy the generator up to the point where you decommission it, if you take into account all of the costs, the capex, the operation cost, the maintenance cost, that cost per unit, per kilowatt hour, sits in the range of 15 to 20 rand a unit. Now, you can easily, with solar and storage, achieve a LCOE in the range of 2 rand, I want to say maximum 3 rand a unit. So it's a no-brainer. Yes, the capex is much higher, but if you look long-term, you just see that financially it's there. That's why, and I'm always of the view, if banks are willing to pay and provide funding, it says something about their confidence in terms of the technology itself. And that wasn't the case a few years back. When we had these big solar farms under the IPP program, there were so many things that they had to put in place to make sure that their risks are maintained. And I foresee that is what we're going to see with the existing technology. And my hope is that we will, with the new technology, see also that uptake, that we don't miss out with the rest of the world. Maybe also just something I want to mention while I'm talking about the rest of the world. In the South African context, the big push for alternative energy in the form of backup and storage and independent power supply is because of load shedding. I want to say mainly load shedding. In other countries, that's not the case. We have the war situation in Europe that's obviously pushing them to become more independent because they're dependent on the gas from Russia. But there's a lot of pressure on them to decarbonize the economy. And the challenge that they've got is that they've got limited renewable energy sources, and if they really want to increase their decarbonization targets, it's achieved with storage. So that's another reason why there's a big push. And I think it's an exciting time to live because worldwide there's this very big push and funding and research and investigation being done to see how can we improve the efficiency and the performance of renewable energy, but also to improve and find other storage alternatives in the context of what we need now. So I think we're in an exciting time to see what's going to be ahead. Okay, so on the short term, the appropriate use of existing technology is more important. So what I mean with that is, for example, I spoke about biogas as an alternative to investigate. But I think the thing is that we already sit with working building blocks. And the question is, how are we going to apply these building blocks, not just to work for me as an isolated independent person, but also in terms of my neighbors, also in terms of the microgrid, also in terms of the whole supply chain. And that's one of the things that we picked up is to say, unfortunately, we operate independently. We think about, okay, this is my operations, this is my energy need, so what solution would work best for me? But if you start looking at the full supply chain in terms of the energy requirements, in terms of the wastage that's available, collectively you could find a solution that actually works for everyone and you could work together. And I think that's really something to think about on the short term while we're waiting for the new technology to mature and to come into the market. Right. So like I've mentioned, alternatives to solar PV or existing technologies needs to be investigated in detail. That's where the whole feasibility study concept comes in. And I foresee that we're going to get and find interesting results in that regard. If you go look at the research that's being done in terms of what's available out there and how it can be used, I think there's a very big untapped resource that we can utilize and can be very specific to your application and to your business model. Okay, and then I just said the importance of understanding and review the energy need of the full supply chain. So again, I don't know if it's a farmer mentality or if it's just a culture that we've got in our country of working independently. And I think that's great why we have forums like this, where we can actually bring all the heads together and say, okay, collectively, yes, I've got my own isolated challenges and I need something that will work for me. But what can we do collectively, and what can we investigate collectively to find solutions that will be beneficial to everyone? And for that, you need to understand your need. And I think everybody has an idea of their own, but we need to add all of that into one big picture and look at it holistically. Because, for example, we tend to think and focus only on what can we do as an alternative power generation or alternative power supply. But how many of the people here started with energy efficiency? How many people here made sure that in terms of energy wastage and in terms of the equipment that we use, it's really energy efficient and it's optimized? Because research has shown we can save up to a very big portion of our load just by becoming energy efficient first. So we tend to think new generation, new generation, new generation, but there's very few that's going back, and just simple things like changing lights to LED, load management, energy efficient appliances, inverter air cons, inverter compressors, and the list goes on. I mean, to give you an example, I think some of you know Cornel Skabort. He's always a presenter and on various forums. He's now at the school, and initially the system that they had to install for the school was, I think, was a 150 kilowatt system. But just because he became energy efficient, the system that he required was now a 50 kilowatt system. And that's one example of many. So I think understanding your energy need will point out these areas of where can we become energy efficient and optimize our energy usage. And once that is done, then you say, okay, now this is our new energy landscape. What would the solution be to supply this new landscape? Great. That's my side. Thank you.
Thank you for it. Don't sit down. We're running a little bit ahead, so I think I'll allow 2 or 3 questions. I think it's very exciting times if we, with the current 600 watt panels only utilizing 20% of what's out there, the sky is the limit. There's still 80% that can be utilized. So I'm sure it's with solar like with the computers. Whatever is new in 2023 will be old technology in 2024. So guys, I'll allow 3 questions. Hans, any questions to Faure? We've got Jack here in front.
My name is Jack from Imperial. I just wanted to find out your thoughts if the hydrogen-powered generators may be another option for consideration with regards to energy efficiency. Your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Great. Okay, so our next presenters can actually divulge much more detail on the hydrogen, but maybe just an overview in terms of the technology. So the big challenge with hydrogen is, one, the capex, the cost to put it in place. The second challenge with hydrogen is its limited efficiency. So we're talking in the range of about 40% efficiency. I don't know, Harvey, you can confirm if it's improved now in the meantime. But 40% efficiency means that you need to, if you put 100% energy in, you're only going to get 40% of that out. Now, if we look at, for example, storage energy-wise, if we look at, for example, lithium ion, the turnaround efficiency from the solar panel, charge controller, battery inverter, back to where you use it, that efficiency is in the range of 75 up to 85%. So you have much less losses compared to the hydrogen application. Where I do foresee hydrogen could play an active role if the efficiency is a challenge is where that gas that's being generated can be used and incorporated in other environments. So for example, if you have hydrogen trucks or hydrogen fuel transport, if you think about tractors and so on. So that might be one application to consider. And maybe just to link the biogas with the hydrogen is that you sit with a methane gas that with certain compounds and changes, you can actually convert that into a hydrogen format. And that can also then be used. So there's also a spin-off or a way to say, okay, maybe the focus is not to generate power from the biogas. Maybe it is to actually utilize the hydrogen gas, not the hydrogen gas, but the methane and the biogas to produce hydrogen. So the potentials are definitely there. And I think in the South African context is if we can do hydrogen, it's a very big plus for our commodity of platinum, because platinum is one of the key elements and materials for biogas. So, for biogas, for hydrogen. So the potential is there. If you ask me where I get excited about hydrogen, it is in the context of there's a very big push worldwide to decarbonize. And some countries has committed, for example, with their vehicles and with their planes, that they will not use fossil fuels in the future. And they want to use green hydrogen. Now, green hydrogen means it's hydrogen that's being produced by renewable energy, not by a coal or nuclear plant. And that's where we can now commoditize our renewable energy in South Africa. And that's why there's a very big push in our country to get the hydrogen industry going. Because now you can go to the Northern Cape, you produce power, not to feed into the grid because the grid is under constraint, but to produce hydrogen. And now you can containerize that energy, take it out of the country, and sell it at a premium. So that's where I get excited in terms of where the hydrogen application could be. In your context, I think there's definitely applications or possibilities, but I still think that we in the development phase or the proofing stage, because a lot of these things are already being in the field and they've tested and tried it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we don't see the new technologies coming in, because they haven't been in the field long enough so that they know how will this thing last 20 or 15 years as expected. But with solar and in batteries, you've got that. So I hope that's okay for now. I think my colleague will expand.
Thanks, Faure. Before I take the second question, if you open your camera and you point it to that block there, you will automatically get all Faure's detail and you can just save it on your phone book. So you will probably be getting a lot of telephone calls, Faure. Guys, ladies and gents, we also have Faure part of the panel later on. So please, if you have questions, I'll allow another question or two for now. But Faure, feel free to divert that to the panel later on if you feel that there's more inputs there that you can use. So any other question for now that we can point towards Faure? Okay, looking forward to a very exciting panel discussion. Thanks, Faure. Let's give Faure a hand of applause. Thanks.